They had survived the jungle. They had walked through the monsoons, trudged across rice paddies soaked in blood and rain, slept in foxholes, and woken up to gunfire. They had counted the days, not by calendars, but by the number of patrols left, or how many letters came from home. Some left friends behind in the dirt of a foreign land. Some came home with pieces of themselves missing, both seen and unseen. And when they finally stepped off the plane, expecting something, anything, to mark the end of their war, they were greeted with silence. No bands, no parades, no welcome signs, just the cold concrete of American airports and the averted eyes of strangers. In World War II, returning soldiers had been showered with confetti and cheers. Entire towns lined up to greet them. There were hugs, banners, brass bands, and ticker tape parades. Even in Korea, there had been some measure of acknowledgement. But for the boys coming home from Vietnam, it was different, profoundly different. Some were warned before landing, take off the uniform before you step outside. Don't let anyone see it. And many did. They walked into the airport restrooms in olive drab and came out in jeans and T-shirts. The war was over, for them at least, but the battle for dignity was just beginning. A few tried to strike up conversations. "Where you coming from, buddy?" "Vietnam." And suddenly the smiles faded. Faces stiffened. The conversation ended. For many Americans back home, Vietnam had become a dirty word. The war was televised into living rooms every night. Images of napalm, burning villages, and body bags left deep scars. The lines between war and warriors blurred, and somewhere along the way, the soldiers themselves became the targets of anger. There are stories, too many to count, of vets being called baby killers at bus stops, of people spitting near their boots in public, of being denied jobs, housing, or even a friendly handshake. Some soldiers, just back from hell, tried to go back to school. But college campuses were hotbeds of anti-war protests. The irony was heavy. The young man sitting in the back of a philosophy class had seen more of life and death than his professor ever would. But no one wanted to hear his thoughts. He wasn't a hero. He was a reminder of something most people wanted to forget. So what did many veterans do? They shut down. They didn't talk about it, didn't bring it up at family dinners, didn't tell their children, didn't hang their medals, didn't keep pictures. In fact, many would spend decades pretending they had never gone at all. You could walk past a Vietnam veteran at a diner in the 70s or 80s, and you'd never know. No hat, no jacket, no patch. Just a man nursing a black coffee, staring at nothing. Some tried to find jobs, any job, but adjusting was hard. You don't go from dodging mortars to folding shirts at Sears without something inside you cracking a little. A few veterans made it work, got married, started families, climbed ladders. But even those who made it carried something inside they couldn't name. A weight, a silence, a certain distance from everyone else in the room. And for those who couldn't adjust, there were bars. Cheap motels, the VA, if you could navigate the red tape, or the streets. Yes, even then, even in the 70s, you could already find Vietnam vets living under bridges or in shelters. Invisible men from an invisible war. But the truth is, they never stopped caring. Many of them still carried the names of fallen friends like prayers. Some kept dog tags and sock drawers. Some still had dreams, sweaty, loud, painful dreams that woke them at 3 a.m. And some, perhaps most heartbreakingly, still believed that what they had done had meant something, that the sacrifices weren't wasted, that the country they returned to would one day understand. Now, if you've made it this far into their story, thank you, because this story isn't always easy to hear. If you believe stories like this matter, stories that history forgot but hearts remember, consider subscribing to the channel. We bring voices from the silence, and with your support, we can make sure they're not lost again. Back in 1969, a returning veteran named John landed at LAX. He'd just come from a fire base near the Cambodian border, still had jungle mud on his boots. He stepped off the plane expecting something, maybe his mom and dad, maybe a flag. Instead, he got cursed at by a man holding a protest sign. No one offered a ride. No one said, "Thank you." So he walked 5 miles down the highway toward home. Eventually, someone picked him up, an old man in a rusted truck who didn't ask questions, just drove. Years later, John would joke, "I came back with medals and all I got was a sunburn and a ride from a guy who smelled like onions." But the joke always had a bitter edge. There's something you should know about these veterans. They didn't lose the war. They were sent to fight it, then sent home with the blame. They didn't choose to come back in silence. We, the country, chose silence for them. And that silence, it stayed. It stayed in living rooms where no one asked Dad about Vietnam. It stayed in photo albums with missing years. It stayed in documentaries that skipped their side of the story. It stayed in the empty seats at 4th of July parades. But history doesn't end here. Their story doesn't stop at the silence, because some veterans, tired of pretending, would eventually begin to speak. Not loudly, not angrily, but truthfully. And that's where we'll pick up in part 2. They tried to move on, tried to get jobs, tried to be husbands, tried to forget the sound of helicopters overhead or the smell of burning rubber and jungle. But something followed them home. It didn't wear a uniform. It didn't show up in the mirror. But it was always there. They didn't have a name for it yet. PTSD wasn't widely understood in the 1970s. It was called shell shock, or combat fatigue, or worse, just bad behavior. When a veteran screamed in his sleep or flinched at loud noises, people thought he was just weird. When he drank too much or couldn't hold a job, they said he was lazy. When he yelled at his kids or withdrew from his wife, they blamed his character. But inside, he was still in the jungle, still hearing gunfire at night, still smelling blood on his boots, still seeing the face of a friend who didn't make it. One veteran, Mike, returned to his hometown in Ohio. He was 22 years old, missing part of his calf, and carried a Purple Heart in a box he never opened. He couldn't sleep more than 3 hours at a time. Fireworks on the 4th of July sent him into a panic. The smell of gasoline made him nauseous. It reminded him of napalm. He applied for jobs at the post office, the steel mill, and the grocery store. Each time, someone smiled politely and said, "We'll call you." They never did. He eventually took a night shift as a janitor at a high school because no one was around to ask him questions. He liked it that way. There were thousands like Mike, men who came back with their bodies intact, but their souls torn to pieces. They gathered in corners of America's cities, quiet, anonymous, often homeless. In San Francisco, they filled the Tenderloin District. In New York, they wandered near the Bowery. In Los Angeles, they showed up in shelters near Skid Row. Many of them couldn't even afford to be angry. They were just tired. The Veterans Administration, the VA, was supposed to help. But in the 70s, it was overwhelmed, underfunded, and still running on policies from World War II. A vet could wait months for a basic medical appointment. Mental health support was nearly non-existent. PTSD treatment, it was barely acknowledged. Some tried anyway. They filled out the forms, sat through the interviews, told strangers about nightmares and guilt and the smell of rot that never went away, and then sometimes they were told, "There's nothing we can do. You seem stable enough." So they turned to each other. In small rooms across the country, church basements, American Legion halls, back rooms of bars, they started talking, one-on-one, man-to-man, vet to vet. It started with, "You have trouble sleeping?" "Yeah, every night." "Do crowds freak you out?" "Can't even go to the grocery store." "You ever feel like you left part of yourself back there?" Every damn day. Out of those conversations, something began to form. Not quite therapy, not religion, but something sacred, brotherhood, a second unit, no ranks, no orders, just understanding. There were motorcycle groups like the Vietnam Vets MC. They rode together, not for thrills, but for peace. The roar of the engine drowned out the roar in their heads. There were advocacy groups like Vietnam Veterans of America. Their motto was, "Never again will one generation of veterans abandon another." That wasn't just a slogan, it was a promise. They had been forgotten, and they swore no one else would be. But not every vet made it. The suicide rate among Vietnam veterans remained high for decades. Some couldn't escape the memories. Some couldn't find jobs or housing or love. Some just gave up. It wasn't weakness. It was exhaustion. They had fought a war, then came home and had to fight for a reason to stay. One veteran named Henry wrote a letter to his daughter before taking his own life in 1983. In it, he said, "I wanted to be a father to you, I really did. But I never got out of that damn jungle. I came home with dirt in my boots and ghosts in my chest. I'm tired of pretending I'm okay." Stories like Henry's weren't rare, but they weren't told either. Hollywood wasn't making movies about their pain. Schools didn't teach about their struggles. Memorial Day speeches barely mentioned Vietnam vets. And if they did, it was brief and vague. America wanted to move on, but the veterans couldn't. Even the memorials came slowly. There was no national monument for years. It wasn't until the early 1980s that the idea of a Vietnam Veterans Memorial began to take shape. And even then it was controversial. Some thought it was too somber, too black, too low to the ground, too quiet. But maybe that was the point. It wasn't a monument for celebration. It was a place to mourn, to reflect, to remember. In 1982, when the wall was finally dedicated in Washington, D.C., something extraordinary happened. Tens of thousands of Vietnam vets showed up. Many for the first time ever wore hats, pins, jackets, anything that said, "I served." They stood in front of a black granite wall etched with over 58,000 names. And they cried. Some touched names they knew. Some left dog tags, letters, boots, cigarettes. Some said things they had been holding inside for years. "I'm sorry I made it home and you didn't. I tried to live a life worthy of your sacrifice." They finally remembered us. But that was still years away. Back in the 1970s, the silence was thick. If a Vietnam veteran wanted peace, he had to build it himself. And build it they did. Some became counselors. Some became activists. Some wrote books, poems, songs. Some never spoke a word, but held their brothers up anyway. They may have come home to silence, but they didn't stay quiet forever. Their anger became action. Their pain became purpose. Their isolation became community. In Part 3, we'll walk with them into the final chapters, how a generation of men who were once called killers became mentors, patriots, and keepers of memory. We'll visit the wall, we'll hear from those still carrying the burden, and we'll ask a simple question. What does it mean to say, "Welcome home," when it's decades too late? It didn't happen overnight. There was no speech, no magic switch, no national awakening where America suddenly remembered the men it had forgotten. Number healing for the Vietnam veteran came slowly. One handshake, one hard-won conversation, one small act of recognition at a time. But it did come. Eventually, it started in whispers. A neighbor quietly saying, "You were in Nam, weren't you?" A clerk at a gas station nodding at a hat that read, "Vietnam Vet." A child asking their grandfather, "Were you scared over there?" And for the first time in a long time, the veteran said, "Yes." And then he kept talking. In the early 1980s, a movement began to take shape, led not by politicians or celebrities, but by veterans themselves. They pushed for recognition. They organized reunions. They showed up at town halls and said, "We were there. We matter. Our story isn't over." They weren't looking for medals or praise. They just wanted to be seen, to be heard, to stop being ghosts in the land they once defended. Then came the wall, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. Two long black granite arms stretching gently into the earth, engraved with the names of the fallen. No flags, no statues, just names. Over 58,000 of them. It opened in 1982, and from that day on, the silence began to break. Veterans from all over the country came to see it. Some came in wheelchairs, some came with canes, some came alone, and some with family who had never heard them speak of the war. They stood in front of the names and wept, whispered, remembered. Some touched names with trembling fingers. Others left behind relics, boots, letters, photos, cigarettes, medals. The National Park Service has collected over 400,000 of these items since the wall opened. Each one says, "I was here. I remember. I still carry you." Jim, a Vietnam vet from Arizona, visited the wall in 1984. He brought a crumpled photo of his best friend Danny, killed in 1969. He placed it under the name Daniel R. Harmon, then stood in silence for 10 minutes. He didn't cry, didn't speak. Then he said softly, "They finally wrote you down, buddy. You're not lost anymore." And yet, not every veteran could make that pilgrimage. Some were too old, some too ill, some too far gone in spirit. So other walls were built. Traveling versions of the memorial toured the country. Smaller replicas appeared in towns across America. Ceremonies were held, speeches made, flags raised. But still, something lingered, a question. Would the country ever truly say, "Welcome home"? In 2012, something rare happened. The U.S. government officially declared March 29th as National Vietnam War Veterans Day. And in 2017, it became a permanent annual observance. Finally, more than 4 decades after the war ended, the nation said, in its own way, "We remember. Thank you. Welcome home." But what does welcome home mean after so much time? It's not just about saying the words. It's about listening to the silence these men endured for decades. It's about understanding the price they paid, not just in the jungle, but in their own living rooms, workplaces, and hearts. It's about recognizing that their war didn't end in Vietnam. It followed them home. And yet, many of them found a way to forgive, Today, you'll meet Vietnam veterans at VA hospitals, at community centers, at parades where they now stand proudly in formation. Some ride with the Patriot Guard. Some serve as mentors to younger vets from Iraq and Afghanistan. Some speak at schools, telling students not about politics or victory, but about friendship, survival, and the cost of service. Their pain didn't disappear, but it changed form. It became wisdom. Take Leonard, for example. He served in the Mekong Delta, came home in '71, and didn't speak a word about it for 25 years. Then in his 60s, he started writing poetry. Raw, simple, beautiful words about mud, blood, and brothers. He published a small book, shared it with other vets, and now leads a group called Healing Through Words in Michigan. He says, "The war took a lot, but it left me this. If I can help one other guy sleep better, it was worth writing down." Or Maria, a former Army nurse. She saw more wounds in a year than most surgeons see in a lifetime. When she came back, no one asked her what it was like. They just assumed she was fine. Years later, she began volunteering at a VA hospice, sitting with dying veterans and holding their hands. "It's like I'm finishing the job," she says. "I couldn't save them all back then, but I can be here now." That's the story of the Vietnam War veterans. They were ignored, but they didn't vanish. They were silenced, but they didn't stop speaking. They were broken, but they rebuilt each other. They formed a quiet army, not of rifles, but of resilience. They taught America what happens when you send young men to war and forget to bring them home emotionally. They taught us how to remember and how to heal. Today, if you see an older man wearing a faded Vietnam veteran cap at a diner or grocery store, say something, just a few words. "Thank you," or even better, "Welcome home." It's never too late to say it, and it's always the right time to mean it.